store clerks lying on the floor during a robbery. And often signs of psychopathy can show up early in children who beat up kids much smaller than themselves, torture animals, don't seem to respond to entreaties by their parents to, how would you feel if, or think about the way it makes someone else feel. I don't think anyone knows the causes. There's some evidence that it's like everything, it's partly heritable, but nowhere near completely heritable. It's probably tied to activity in the frontal lobes, possibly also the amygdala, a brain structure tightly connected to the frontal lobes that seems to process the emotional valence of stimuli. So not completely understood, but the clinical syndrome has been repeatedly documented. Probably Ted Bundy would be the prototype case, often superficially charming and socially skilled, but utterly lacking in any sense of remorse or empathy. Yes?
In light of the way in which our technology is now helping us manipulate our appearances, to what extent will this push genetic selection to select for behaviors more than for physical traits?
Yeah. You mean by genetic engineering?
No, not by genetic engineering, but just if you can go out and have plastic surgery, then that's going to change your appearance. So people are not so much making the, quote, right decision for selecting for this favorable gene. They're actually selecting for a disfavored gene.
I think that it's really impossible to tell what effect on biological evolution our current cultural practices will lead to, simply because biological evolution requires that certain kinds of selection contingencies be in place over a long enough period of time and over some kind of cohesive group of organisms in order to have its effect. So one could always speculate what would the human species be like if the current practices now extended over 100,000 years and applied to one culture that was hermetically sealed from other cultures. But given that we lurch from lifestyle to lifestyle pretty quickly, no one can predict how we'll be living in 100 years. And there's no part of the human planet in which you have a self-contained set of breeding isolates, but you have constant immigration and emigration. We're a moving target for biological evolution. And it's possible that we're not evolving in any particular direction. We know in other cases of evolution that species don't change, sometimes over millions of years. And although no one can, you'd have to sort of go into a time machine in the future to answer the question. I think there's reason to believe that there's no consistent change in human evolution that we can spot right now.
Okay.
At least evolution in the biological sense. Yes?
I'm sure that your statement or finding that children are not shaped by parents as much as they are by genes, culture, and chance surprised many. But I would like to know what study or studies did you use to support that statement, and also what or how it was measured and where they were conducted.
Yes. There's by now a large number of studies from behavior geneticists. Most people hear about these studies because they remember the findings that there is some statistical genetic influence on behavior, such as the fact that twins separated at birth are highly similar. But those same studies try to see whether growing up in a given home has a lasting effect. And often to the shock of the researchers themselves, who are sure, since let's say the effect of the genes is 40 to 50% of the variation in a particular sample. What everyone expected would be that the other 50 to 60% would come from the home, from growing up in the same home. So that, say, adopted siblings growing up in the same home should be much more similar than randomly selected pairs of people. And in study after study, done in numerous countries, United States, Scandinavia, Western Europe, time and again, the results came out to be 0 to 10% of the variation being attributed to a given family. So there are two sets of studies that use different techniques but have the same conclusion, namely sibs separated at birth are no less similar than sibs brought up together, and adopted siblings are not similar at all. Corroborating that, there are a number of studies of that look at parenting in other ways that I think also are consistent with this finding. And the person who really deserves credit for summing it up is Judith Rich Harris in her book, The Nurture Assumption. She also points out that studies that compare different kids growing up in very different circumstances, only children versus children with siblings, kids who spend a lot of time in daycare versus those with stay-at-home moms, kids with 2 lesbian mothers versus one of each sex, kids who grow up in a hippie commune as opposed to a kind of Leave It to Beaver home. In all of those cases, the effects are pretty close to zero. So that's a whole set of corroborations of what the behavioral geneticists tell us about the long-term effects of parenting. Then on top of that, here's just sort of a common sense observation that I think is very robust. If you look at immigration, you look at cases where kids grow up in one culture and their parents come from another culture. How do the kids end up? Take accent as a salient example. The answer is in virtually every case, kids grow up with the accent of their peers, not the accent of their parents, and not even something that's halfway in between the accent of their peers and their parents. Likewise with styles of dress, tastes in music, and so on. So the upshot of these studies is not by no means that genes are everything, because they show conclusively that genes generally don't account for more than half of the variance. Now, it's a lot more than zero. It's a lot less than 100%. What it suggests is that culture matters. That is not the individual parents, but the surrounding peer culture, and probably also that chance matters.
Excuse me, just
Yeah.
addition here is that it seems to me that, I mean, that's why I asked what was actually measured, because if you measure in behavioral way, like how they walk, how they dress, etc., then definitely, I mean, parents do not have to have a certain strong role in that. However, if you measure value system that is actually underneath our skin, I mean, it's somewhere in there. It's not really that visible, and it's not as easy to measure it.
Yeah.
And it kind of operates our behavior kind of down the line.
Yeah.
Then this is kind of where I'm a little bit just, curious whether they were measuring just, how they dress, how they talk, what they do in an elevator, as you
Yes.
said, or,
Right.
or they actually measured a value system to
Well, here's some of the things they did measure that are at least indirectly relevant to the value system. One of it is, what they do most often is give tests of personality, and these are batteries that many of you may have filled out, where you do a checklist of 550 statements that are then, the numbers are then crunched, and they indicate more or less reliably how conscientious someone is, that is whether they they're responsible and attend to details, or whether they're more sloppy and irresponsible. How agreeable versus antagonistic they are, that is, do they basically sort of like people, or are they basically hostile to other people, whether they're neurotic or self-confident, introverted, extroverted. So these are some of the things that are where you can't measure an effect of the home and family. Also, there's some concrete, cut-and-dried behavioral statistics that fall under this generalization. Likelihood of getting divorced, likelihood of getting into trouble with the law, which is, again, not shows an environmental effect of neighborhood sometimes, but not one of typically one of parents. Number of cigarettes smoked, number of hours of television watched. The generalization is just about anything you measure shows an effect of genes that's greater than zero, less than 100%, an effect of parenting that is small, 0 to 10%, an effect of something else, presumably culture and chance, that is about 50% of the variation.
Thank you.
Yes?
To what degree do you think that art or aesthetic judgments might be constrained or shaped by biological human nature? Or maybe phrased another way, what potential or relevance do you think that cognitive science has in discussions of the humanities about aesthetic value or quality?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I have a chapter on that kind of topic. I think there is an influence that's often underestimated in the contemporary world of criticism, that there are patterns, universal patterns in music, there are universal visual motifs such as